What's up YouTube? The much awaited and much needed patch 3.4 notes just dropped, which are hopefully going to save us from the dominance of Bandle City. I'll just record my reaction as well as some initial predictions right as this went live. I haven't seen any of the patch notes yet. All I know is that the little balance experiment that we were promised would be a couple of new cards added. That was leaked a little bit early on Twitter, so I already got a glimpse of those.
Is it the mustache? Who knows?
Alright, this comment might actually be interesting. New cards. We're experimenting with a new approach to life balance this patch. In addition to the usual card updates, we've taken a holistic look at game, blah, blah, blah. We're changing existing cards, so instead we are adding a few cards. Alright. So you'll see more of that in the future. That's an interesting take. I do think I like it because a couple of impactful cards can already change the meta game significantly. First of all, Desert Duel. 3 mana, slow speed, give an enemy -2/-0 this round. An ally and that enemy strike each other. So a knockoff of single combat, I would say. This card will mainly be held back by slow speed and not being able to react to open attacks. Nonetheless, can be very good in decks that run stuff like Sever or Akshan, of course, and might be a nice addition to Mono Shurima, right? The region's biggest issue was lacking proper removal, besides just vulnerable. That at least partially fixes it, and it's somewhat mana efficient. But we have some other changes in the patch to help Shurima handle multiple enemies. Always been reliant on vulnerable to addressing her targets. Agreed? Agreed. Okay, that's actually cool. Oh, a little clip. I mean, pretty straightforward. Nothing too fancy about this. Okay, so a removal tool that potentially does not come at too much of a cost. Especially if you just try to remove back row value engines, right? Stuff like Bandle City Mayor, which is low attack anyway. Moving on, Celestial Wonder, a new Targon main deckable spell. Not a Celestial card, even though the name might make you think so. Targon is great at creating large single threats, but can struggle with wider boards, where we don't want to change that identity entirely. We don't. Give them an option for slowing down multiple attackers so that their slower game plan has a chance. Yeah, at the current point in time, much needed, I think. Targon used to be the supreme control region back when the meta was much slower and much less power crept. And now their biggest culprit, their biggest downfall is that pretty much all of their stuff is slow speed or very expensive, and they cannot react to open attacks very nicely outside of Hush. And therefore, in a full-on control archetype, this card might be a nice addition as a 1 or 2 of. I mean, it is of course a bit pricey and it doesn't really permanently impact the board, but it's still something that Targon was lacking and that it might have been needing. Let's have a look at what the animation looks like. Of course, pairing it with Yasuo, who would have guessed? I mean, Yasuo is still not going to be a thing, but the card itself is really neat. And people are going to try it. It's still a buff to Yasuo. It's just not enough to make Yasuo playable. Okay, this one's the one that I'm actually most intrigued by. This one I already saw on Twitter. Rocket Barrage, 5 mana slow speed, which is also a big minus, but the effect can be very nice. Deal 3 to an enemy and 1 to all other enemies. My immediate thought, of course, would be, damn, pair this with Funsmith and you have a banger of a card. But just like in this scenario, even against aggro, this can be very nice. PNZ always had some pretty solid single target removal in Mystic Shot, Get Excited, Some Fumes, and Thermo Beam for big threats, but doesn't really have great AoE removal. Static Shock at this point is very overpriced for how little it impacts the board. Caitlyn traps her to random, of course, and Time Winder just comes at too much of a cost with having to discard a card. All of them only focus 2 targets. I mean, True Shot Barrage is a meme. This could be something that PNZ was missing, at least the combo and control part of PNZ. Direct damage is meant to be a strength of pillar. It's definitely not. AoE options were not living up to that dream. Agreed. Okay. Yeah, this is interesting. I feel like out of the 3 this would be the card with the most competitive potential. Like, people are going to play the other two more because it's Mono Shurima and it's a Yasuo support card, so of course people are going to mess around with this. But this one could actually be solid. Right, it's an Ezreal trigger at the same time. You one or two of in quite a few control-ish decks. Like Ezreal Noxus, Ezreal Karma maybe. Some Heimerdinger decks maybe. Just 1 mana too cheap to be double cast by Jace, but nonetheless, interesting card overall. Okay, now we come to the juicy part here. Card updates. As mentioned, blah blah blah. We want to make sure that every region had some tools to deal with the threats they might face. That being said, there are a few cards not being updated yet that we want to provide some extra content on. Uh-oh. All right, let's read the reasoning first before we jump to preemptive conclusions. We work on these patches several weeks in advance, and we worked on this one earlier than usual due to our week out. All right, that was like the Riot holiday type of thing. Yordles and Arms wasn't seen nearly as much play when these changes were locked, but we're watching it now. The new removal cards being added, along with the other changes this patch, should have an effect on... We're keeping an eye on it. That is true, the Rocket Barrage is pretty good against Bandle City. The Targon stun card can be good against Yordles and Arms as well. Bandle tree, we have changes planned for the Bandle tree to alleviate the lack of interactivity in its win condition. Interesting, but the changes are more complex to implement, so we have that targeted for our next balance patch on April 27. 1 more month of Bandle tree. Bit of a bummer, both of these mentions, but at least they're aware of the problems. And let's see if Bandle City gets hit enough as a region. This is totally endurable. Anyway, aphelios. Aphelios isn't changing directly, but we're bundling these moon weapon updates in the champion section. Very blah blah blah. Moon weapons to 3 mana. Okay, they cost 2 again, but gifts from beyond is also 2. As we've also adjusted other cards he works well with. I think moon weapons would be mostly safe at their original cost again. Interesting. I think the community is very much gonna like this one. Aphelios has been a fan favorite for most of the time when he was not completely meta dominant. So most of the time he was not overpowered. People loved Aphelios out of nostalgia, out of the interesting play patterns he provides. Let's look at the changes, and this is a very important one. Crescendum, instead of summoning a 2-cost follower from your deck, you summon a 2-cost follower from your regions, which is a lot weaker, but also means you have less of a deck building cost if you play Aphelios. Crescendo. Crescendo, isn't that like the Sona ultimate? Balance problem at any reasonable cost because of its ability, blah blah blah. Yeah, reasonable change. It does take away a cool-ish tutor from the game, but I do really like this change for a number of reasons. And honestly, the most important one is not even Aphelios, but you finally cannot tutor Eye of the Dragon in Lee Sin decks anymore. And before the patch, I was very afraid that Lee Sin might not get touched in any specific case, because I feel like if other decks get nerfed, Lee Sin in high level play in the competitive meta is just going to take over completely. Like if Darkness and Tree and so on get hit, if Bandle City gets hit overall. Anyway, let's read the rest of the patch first. Azir, summon 13 plus units or landmarks. Man, they're still trying to make Mono Shurima playable desperately. I appreciate it though. They're still looking out for their Shuriman cars. Azir's love of units and Shurima's love of landmarks. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, interesting. Yes, let's go. 1 attack gone from Gnar. Is that the only change though? I've seen Gnar around. That's a quality troll. You may have seen Gnar around Runeterra occasionally recently. But we're happy to see a newly released champion succeed. Can't be too much of a good thing. Okay. Still arguably the strongest or one of the strongest champions in the game. It's a step in the right direction. Gnar probably needs 1 or 2 more tweaks though, like for example making the Pokestick fleeting. In my eyes still too strong of a card, but it's fine. It's a bit of a change. Pantheon gets 1 attack removed from him. Same thing again. I'm happy that they're addressing these champions that are definitely too strong. Not sure if this is enough, but let's see what other changes will be implemented to their region and their packages. Pantheon has been succeeding in a number of strategies. Oh, no kidding. When this new okay, fair. Moving on, Pyke does get one attack removed. Interesting. Lurkers have been a consistent force for a good bit of time now, and while they're completely dominant, we think that taking a few teeth of the sharks could let other decks shine more. I mean, I don't mind it. I've never played Lurk myself. I don't think the deck is super interesting. And I think it's very frustrating to play against. So I'm kind of fine with it taking a bit of a hit. I don't think it was necessary power level wise. But it does make Pyke a bit less ridiculous to play against. Because it was like, there were just some Lurk high rolls that you could never beat, right? And one of them was getting like double death from below, or like Pyke bone skewer shenanigans that you could never address. And that makes it much harder to flip Pyke and make him remove the whole board. Rumble gets a bit of a buff. Instead of dealing 12 plus damage himself, he needs to see allied mecha yordles deal 12 plus damage. Very cute change. Because this does not change Rumble's power level at all in decks where you don't go for mecha yordles, which would, for example, be Draven Rumble Burn, but entices and incentivizes people to actually play the mecha yordle package, and it indirectly buffs the whole mecha yordle archetype, which is of course underpowered as of right now. Creative change, cute change. I do like it. Rumble has been having some success on his own. His mecha yordle friends have spent most of their time on the scrap heap. Whoever is writing these texts, good job. Are giving several of the weaker mechs a tune-up and making sure Rumble plays more nicely with his mecha yordle pals. Okay, +1 attack, +1 attack, +1 each. What does this even do? Premium +0/+2 for each card you discarded. Okay. I don't think I've ever seen Salty Spinner. A 3/3. Oh, this is actually a big buff. I always thought this card might be the one with the most potential. At least on paper. The issue is mid-range is just not very playable. Meta is too fast for like deck buff type of archetypes to really pay off. Yeah, overall, nice changes, I would say. All of this on its own is not going to be enough to make mecha yordles solid. But if the meta shifts overall, maybe there will be a niche for them. Talking about the meta shifting, moving on. Hex core upgrade now costs 0. Let's go! Viktor's machine evolution already asks a lot out of a player. Between him, blah blah blah, playing stone. Taking the mana cost of the hex core, and we hope Viktor can. Okay, this is huge. And this is, yeah, what can I say? Like, you always had mana problems playing Viktor. Now getting a 0 cost buff that triggers augment that is also discard fodder and that scales incredibly well into the late game, accelerating the Viktor level up, that's actually a pretty important thing. Like, it makes Viktor so much more tempo able. I do really like that change. And I do think that might be enough to see Viktor in a couple of actual meta decks. Like, not meta definers necessarily, not dominating meta decks, but counters maybe. Or maybe some creative, aggressive discard decks. Like, I think Viktor, what was it, Viktor Vi, Viktor Rumble used to be a thing at some point. Dunebreaker gets 1 HP removed. As with Pyke, we're toning down Dunebreaker to help other decks shine against Lurk more overall. Again, didn't feel like it was needed, but I don't mind it. I can't stand Lurk. Catalyzer! Let's go! Much like Lurker's, Darkness has been a deck holding its own at the top of the meta for a long while without ever really taking over. Debatable. I mean, tournaments at High Masters ladder was quite Darkness heavy to say the least. Wanted to reduce their ability to trade off with aggressive minions early while also progressing late. Important change? I wonder if this is the best change though. The issue is still, like, if you play against Darkness and you don't have a blocker on turn 2, and this hits twice, you kind of lose the game by default. I saw a change suggestion by Kuvira, which made this a 2-mana 2/3 and said, strike, same effect, but afterwards silence me. So you can only get one darkness stack off of a catalyzer. I would have preferred that, but this is much better than nothing. Vanguard Sergeant gets turned back into a 3/3. That's interesting. I feel like that was the wrong card to hit, but I do think Demacia needs to be toned down in some way. Like, I think cards, some of the new additions are bigger problems than Sergeant, like Patricide Broadwing, obviously. In a way, also Durant Sculptor fitting decks like Scouts, which it was originally not intended to be for, but I mean, anything that kind of hits Demacia rally piles, I'm somewhat happy about. It's a bit sad for like Lux decks and so on. Turning this one back, but going to look at more changes to elites in a future patch. I mean, trying to bring mid-range back, maybe? Sounds interesting, sounds fun. Okay, and now comes the most important and most interesting portion of this patch. Stat nerfs to some manifest cards. Conchologist is now a 2/1. Fair change. Loping Telescope 3 mana 2/2. A bandle city is meant to be good at manifesting answers. These two were doing so at a remarkably efficient rate. Unfortunately, Telescope can still invoke epics. One interesting change would have been that instead of the epic pool, you would get a card out of the Fey pool, for example. But, I mean, both changes make a lot of sense and are definitely much deserved. Especially Conchologist, you could just play in literally any Bandle City deck, it would be good. To some extent, you could also say the same about Loping Telescope. Yeah, I'm fine with these changes, totally on board. Paddle Star gets 1 extra damage. Targon is meant to be good at handling single threats slowly regardless of size. Paddle Star was certainly nailing the slowly part, but was falling short against larger targets. This in addition with a stun card that was added. Interesting. Does that make Paddle Star playable? Not Paddle Star on its own, but maybe the other thing, the Sleepy Trouble Bubble. I still don't think you play more than like 1 copy of it. It's a cute change. Like, I do appreciate that they recognize what Targon was lacking and why it fell behind, and they're kind of trying to fill that niche, like to fill that hole without exaggerating it, like without giving them too many tools at once. It's a reasonable change. I don't think this is going to be too impactful. I don't mind it. Give an enemy -4 and disable keywords. Give 1 enemy -4. Or 2 enemies -2. Disable their positive keywords. That's a huge buff. That is big. That makes quicksand so much better against pantheon decks as well. Quicksand was potentially a potent answer to enemies with strong keywords, but its single target focus often left it ineffective against the kinds of decks it was meant to address. Now it's a much more flexible tool and can be a strong answer to single build up enemy or multiple sneaky little ones. Yeah, this, like, Shurima in general struggles against aggro. Like we mentioned earlier on, they have no proper fast speed removal, which means they're weak to open attacks. So stuff like spider aggro, some types of burn aggro, and quicksand makes these matchups so much better. Like being able to block 2 units at once without losing your blockers is a great way to regain tempo, or keep 1 unit alive and prevent the other one from damaging your nexus. This is a pretty big change. And of course the keyword thing can be huge, playing against decks like Pantheon. Like in some situations this can be a double hush, right? With a stat debuff. That's enormous, like quicksand is really freaking strong now. Alright, She Who Wanders. Obliterate all units in play for less power. Instead of all followers. Sneaky Targon's peak buff? Interesting. We've all come a long way since She Who Wins was dominating. And since she was restricted, I think that was like alpha or beta days, closed beta. Since she was restricted to only hit followers, she has mostly wandered out of people's decks. We still want her to be a top-rate finisher, and letting her disrupt the opposing game plan more effectively will hopefully give her a role as a late-game option. That's a good change. Not enough to make Freljord control viable, per se. But at least in more niche decks and meme decks, it's card's gonna be an interesting option. And for decks like Targon's Peak and Turbo Ramp decks. Sheriff Lariette Rose. This is a card that I always felt was very overlooked. I mean, maybe it's just not in the right region. Maybe the effect just comes into play too late. But like the effect itself is strong, right? Paired with an okay stat line. So she gets +1/+1. As a strong effect when she enters play, but was often unable to lay down the law effectively on her own. With a few extra stats, we think she'll be a more effective answer for Bilgewater decks looking to answer larger units. It's interesting. It's very interesting. Wonder if that makes some vulnerable based archetypes more viable. Maybe paired with Renekton, maybe paired with MF. I feel like that change is not enough to make the card playable. I still appreciate them doing this change. It's interesting. Maybe a deck will pop off where this card can actually shine. I mean, maybe it's some Undying type of stuff. Bilgewater SI. Cursed Keeper. Who knows? Who knows? Sharps. Okay, now we get to the big impactful changes here. Sharpsight is now +1/+2 instead of +2/+2. That's enormous. I mean, Sharpsight was pretty much a 3-up in any Demacia deck. Twin Disciplines, a +2 attack or +3 HP. Big nerf to Lee Sin and some OTK combo decks. Would also have been a big nerf to Ahri, but Ahri is already not seeing play anymore. Don't think it's a bad change by any means. Like, Ionia does kind of need that protective effect, but the flexibility and the power of the offensive effect was often too much, especially when paired with quick attack, when paired with keywords like Lee Sin's Overwhelm, doubling the damage effectively. Interesting change. I think I like both of them. Okay, it's gonna be interesting to read the text here. As we were looking at how to enable more interaction for various regions, we realized that these two premier combat tricks were a big part of what made it feel so hard to answer opposing threats. While we like that both Twin Disciplines and Sharpsight are both great defensive answers to removal, the fact that they were also excellent on offense means that decks could include them without losing any aggression. That's a very good point. This change should push players to have a harder choice between protecting their units and including tools that end the game on the spot. Or well, that even like just make them trade better offensively, right? Yeah, I do agree. Kinda glad they included that reasoning. These combat tricks did end up being way too good in a number of offensive decks, right? Like Scouts, like Pantheon even, where they could be flexed offensively as well. With Discipline, same thing with Lee Sin, with Ahri. Moving them a bit more into the direction of actually being defensive combat tricks kind of makes sense game design wise. I like it. I like the changes. Of course, they don't look quite as pretty, but like gameplay effect wise, both of them are much deserved. King Jarvan getting 2 attack at once. A king has a potent effect when his son is around, but hasn't been much of a ruler in his own right. With a little more power, he can do more to hold the throne. Sure. I mean, where could you play this? The Transposition deck, which is a bit of a meme anyway. And I guess some Jarvan Renekton type of thing. Wouldn't be all too strong, but sure, it helps the card. It helps the archetype a little bit. Tattered Band. Okay, interesting. Effect is no longer consumed by units that already have Challenger. This is a small change that should hopefully keep Valor from stealing Quinn's banner all the time. Yeah, that won't impact the card's performance much at all. Sacred Protector. Summon Roshan and blah blah blah. Give an ally barrier and Roshan. Allies with barrier have double attack. Okay, so the change is that now on play, target a unit and give it barrier. Yeah, it's a cute change. Don't think it makes the card very strong. There kind of are other issues, and I mean, Shen just doesn't see much play. Twin Disciplines was nerfed, so overall the deck, like Shen archetypes, wouldn't necessarily get stronger. It's a neat change though. Again, same as with King Jarvan, like it's a cute step in the right direction without probably making the cards really playable or too strong. but it will perform a bit better if you try it out. Sigil of Malice, reducing the cost by 1. Well, we don't want Sigil of Malice to become a premier damage spell without reputation. It can afford to be a little less embarrassing. Change only affects the base cost. Yep. So it's also LeBlanc's champ spell, making her a tiny bit better. Apart from that, the card won't see too much play. I guess you could now, like in full-on PNZ Noxus burn decks, you could now play this a bit more easily. Like those decks that only play 1 drops, 2 drops, 3 drops, and the rest is all burn spells, like all of the burn spells you could find, right? They would sometimes end up splashing Sigil of Malice just because DL2 isn't that bad no matter the cost. But they haven't seen too much play recently. Again, won't impact the matter too much, I think. Creates blah 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 in hand and granted +1/+1. Okay, that's a much needed change. That's also more in line with cards like the Fae thing, the Fae manifesting. I forgot the name. Doesn't make it playable. Yeah, that's kind of all I can say about it. Still a bit memey. Flash bomb trap. Cards that previously planted them in the top 10 cards now plant them in the top 8 cards of an opponent's deck. Caitlyn Sting Officer, Advanced Intelligence. Nice. I mean, the Flash Bomb archetype was just too weak outside of Caitlyn on her own. Flash Bombs are a potent part of the trap strategy, but shuffling them into a larger pool of cards could often leave you wondering where all those traps actually went. Yup. This change should let your bombs pay off more consistently. I mean, still the inherent problem is the heavy RNG, but it's a neat change. As a trap enthusiast, as a puff cap maniac, I am very happy with any type of buffs to trap cards. Moving on, Careful Prep now costs 2. I mean, sure. It's still like, it doesn't really give you a lot of value. It's more of a combo piece when you try to tutor something. It'll still mainly be a meme card or played in tier 4 or 5 decks. But it's something. It's something. Camphor gets +1/+1, and instead of targeting 6... If you've targeted LS 6+ times... If you targeted LS Im 4+ rounds, okay. I see. A Camphor and Pantheon might not get along. We didn't like that they also asked you to track 2 different but very similar forms of targeting allies. It was also looking doubtful that Camphor would find a place in any decks at her current stat line, so we decided to give her a slight boost. 6 mana, 6/5. Ideally, you have Challenger, Overwhelm, and Spell Shield. The card is still not good without Quick Attack. Like, this is just a super bad version of Pantheon. Like, why would you ever play that over Pantheon, first of all? And second of all, if you already play Pantheon, you don't need another finisher. Yeah, still unplayable. Gameplay UX updates. I think that's it for the balance changes. This patch we're introducing the first of a suite of gameplay UX updates. Premonition. I'll just roll the video and we'll see what happens. Okay, so you could see here in the little thingy thing, that's the Nexus Health pre-visualization. Unit destruction, okay. I mean, I guess overall I'm a fan. I gotta admit I'm a bit surprised here because of... You already could get all of that information from the Oracle's Eye. I totally get that a lot of casual players lean to not check it though, and that can be a nice addition and make thought processes and maths a bit easier. Didn't really expect any update like that. I guess I'm kind of indifferent to it. It does make the game look a bit neater, and if that does make it more appealing to a wider audience, then sure, I'm totally on board. Personalization, champion skins. I won't really go through these. This one actually looks cool though. Vernal Cannon. Vernal Pantheon. Looks even more like Camphor. Galio. Swain. Ooh, Swain looks cool. Also, kind of a dope board, I gotta admit. That is cool. It brings back those World of Warcraft, what was it called? Like the magma core vibes. One of the first raids. Cool Poro as well. Gloomtooth is inferior. No, Silverwing doesn't look too bad. Card backs fire. Pew, pew, pew. I think that was all the interesting stuff. Let's check real quick if there's anything interesting here. Loading screen for encounters, sure. Okay, nothing too interesting here in miscellaneous and bug fixes. So that's all for the patch. Also, big props to whoever wrote most of the patch notes. Some parts were truly hilarious. So more synergy and Riot. I am what, Russ. That is so cool. Okay, predictions. What do we expect? What got hit? Pantheon got hit, but only slightly, right? I guess sharpsight is actually a more important nerf there than the stat line nerf. But the deck was just so strong that I think it'll still remain fairly solid in the meta. Of course, Bandle City got hit. The gnar nerf is much needed and fair, but probably not enough. Mecha Yordle buff won't really affect the meta a lot. Conchologist and loping telescope nerfs. So some of the most well-rounded and included cards, as well as the twisted catalyzer nerfs. I'm kind of scrolling the wrong direction here. Give me a second. Here they are. Okay. So Bandle City should drop a little bit performance-wise. I don't think... Well, how hard do the top meta decks really get hit? Stuff like Tristana Rally. I mean, the Sergeant nerf as well as the Sharpsight nerf, as well as nerfs to these. These do matter, especially the Telescope nerf taking out a bit of tempo in those decks that were way too tempo heavy. Also now this card costing 2 after the Bandle City Mayor reduction instead of 1. And also if Gleaming Lantern discount applies, you cannot play this for free anymore. These changes do matter. I still think the decks are gonna be solid to say the least. But not quite as like best deck in the game tier 1 dominant. So ladder win rate should definitely drop. Same can be said for Scouts, which this nerf hits, as well as the Sharpsight nerf. Darkness gets hit by Catalyzer and Conchologist. I'm pretty sure it's still gonna be one of the best top level decks and tournament decks. Like, especially the Catalyzer nerf matters, but not too much. Like, it'll still be tier 1 or tier 2. Bandle Tree didn't really run Conchologist. Telescope is annoying. Gnar nerf matters a bit, but not too much. Bandle Tree will still be a force to reckon with as well. So I do expect Darkness and Tree to still see a lot of play, especially with Pantheon getting a hit as well, which is one of the tougher matchups, especially for Darkness. And with some other decks like Scouts, which could be a rough matchup, also kind of taking some major hits. Now on the flip side, let's look at the buffs. Oh, I forgot to mention, of course, Lee Sin also kind of got nerfed very hard by the Twin Disciplines nerf, as well as the change to Crescendum. And I am a fan of both of these changes. Very interesting to see, like, how much does it really hurt Lee Sin to lose the super consistent tutoring of Eye of the Dragon? Because Lee Sin and Eye of the Dragon used to also be played before Gifts from Beyond got implemented into the game. Back then you would just play it with either Sparklefly or a Mountain Goat as another 2-drop for some board presence to not get overrun by aggro. I could see Lee Sin just going back to that kind of stuff and still being at least a competitive deck. Because it is very hard to play, right? I do think it'll still perform well in seasonal open rounds and open tournaments and high Masters ladder. But the nerfs do matter. Like, this makes it a lot less good against burn decks and aggro decks. And the combo finisher is much harder to put together with the nerf to Twin Disciplines. Anyway, now let's look at the buffs. So Mono Shurima will be played a lot. I still don't think it's going to be good. But the Quicksand buff as well as the Azir buff. Quicksand is the most interesting one. I think that will just become a bit more of a staple combo tricks in decks that splash Shurima, at least as like a 1-off or 2-off. This one I can't really gauge yet. Probably not enough to make Targon playable per se as a control region. But paired with the aphelios buffs, I mean, people will experiment around. And this is the most interesting one. I do think this could see some play in Ezreal type of decks. And I mean, Ezreal decks are already playable. Okay, do any of the other buffs really push something into playability? Aphelios will surely be tried out a lot. That's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on. Like lurk nerf. The Viktor buff is personally to me the most interesting one. I like Viktor getting a very significant buff and pretty much all of the meta staples, all of the common tier 1 and tier 2 decks being hit in some way. Maybe give Viktor a niche in some tier 2 decks. It would be very interesting. I'll definitely try it out. Apart from that, which other buffs did we have? It's not significant enough. Probably not significant enough. Sheriff neither. Jarvan neither. This neither. Traps maybe. No. Okay, mecha yordles probably neither. I find this one very hard to gauge, like interpreting how the meta will unfold. The thing is, so many decks got hit here. I mean, if we just have a look at what the top 10 decks have been like last week, real quick from Balco's meta report. So we have pretty much all of these decks getting some amount of hits, right? Like all of these Demacia and Bandle City decks, of course, suffer from the Sharpsight nerf, from the Vanguard Sergeant nerf, Conchologist, Loping Telescope, Gnar. Darkness got hit a bit. I guess, well, Trundle Gnar got hit, Lurk got hit, everything except for Ezreal Caitlyn got hit. So my first intuition is telling me that these decks will stay forces in the meta game. But it does give other decks much more agency against them, especially Noxus control decks, I would say. Stuff like Ezreal Caitlyn or Swain-based decks. I'm also more interested in Freljord control decks, like based on Blighted Ravine and like maybe Freljord Shadow Isles. TLC has seen some play recently again. Trundle Lissandra control. I just made a video on it as well. I think those types of decks could see a bit of a comeback because, like, especially the Noxus control decks were supposed to counter most of the meta, but they just weren't strong enough to do so effectively. And therefore, all of these decks remained meta forces. But I'll be honest, I do think that especially Yordles and Arms decks, like especially the Piltover and Zone versions, are still gonna be very, very strong because they really didn't get hit enough for how high their power level was. So some of those will probably be meta definers. I still think Silver Akshan didn't get hit enough. It's still gonna be a strong deck. It's only Sharpsight that really mattered. And, I mean, Petricide Broadwing is still untouched. Durant Sculptor for Scouts is still insane. Yeah, I'll be honest, like, the meta is definitely going to be refreshed at first because a lot of people are going to try new stuff, experiment around with new stuff, and that's awesome. Try a lot of these buffed cards and new concepts around it. But I think the strongest decks will more or less remain the same, except that the meta will maybe be a bit more evened out. So like more meta counters will have a bit more success, like those Noxus control decks based around Ravenous Flock. And maybe, who knows, we'll see a bit more classic mid-range like mecha Yordles, and maybe we'll see a bit of Targon control around Aphelios with the new stun card. So this is a very tough patch to predict for me. I'm cautiously optimistic, I would say. I do still think Bandle City will be maybe the strongest region and most played region, but the power level will drop significantly. We're gonna have a phase of a lot of experimentation coming up, and that's always awesome to see. And who knows, maybe the meta will shift completely. You never know in advance. I hope you enjoyed this reaction and prediction analysis or whatever. I'm curious if you actually agree with me, so feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, your opinions, as well as maybe some spicy deck ideas that you'll have with the upcoming patch. Maybe something around Aphelios or Viktor. I'm always curious to read your thoughts as well. And with that being said, enjoy the new patch. Let's hope it's a good one.